private view, so everybody can see that.
Okay, this way. Yeah, during the break, there was something that came to my mind that illustrates both patience and gratitude. And maybe it relates a bit to the question that Madeline in the UK asked about relations with the neighbors, if they're rough. And this is probably a fictional, almost certainly a fictional passage. It comes at the beginning. Excuse me? Okay. At the beginning, there's a work in Pali, but it's not part of the Pali canon, called the Milinda Panna, The Questions of King Milinda. And the book takes the form of a dialogue between a Buddhist monk, who's probably not a historical figure, a fictional figure, named Nagasena, and the king Milinda, which is the Pali or Sanskrit rendering of the name Mananda, who is a Greek king, probably ruling over an area called Bactria, which now corresponds roughly to Pakistan, parts of Pakistan, Afghanistan, where the Greeks had penetrated that far. And it's supposed to be like an encounter of Buddhism with a Greek king who's grounded in the philosophies, the thought of the Greek philosophers, like Socrates, Aristotle. Okay, but the way this work begins, you see, the Buddhists in India are worried that they don't have a really good, qualified, eloquent exponent of the Dharma. And so they appeal to a certain being who is in the divine realm, a deva, who they know is a sort of reincarnation of a former eloquent Buddhist monk. Learned, knowledgeable, eloquent Buddhist monk. They appeal to him to come down and to take rebirth in the human world again, and then to grow up and be nurtured, to be an eloquent exponent of the Dhamma. Maybe this is a little bit like a Theravadan equivalent of the Tibetan Tulku system, where they discover reincarnated lamas. And so this Deva, when he realizes the time is right, he passes away from the heavenly realm, takes rebirth into a Brahmin family. And the Buddhist monks know this, and so they have to sort of find a way to get a hold on this little boy to eventually get him to ordain as a Buddhist monk, and then to get him learned in the scriptures so that he can become the eloquent defender of Buddhism against, maybe this is the encroachment of Greek modes of thinking. And so the elder in the Sangha, he knows the house where the boy has been reborn. And every day when he goes on alms round, he passes by that house and waits a minute or so in front of the house. But the house father never comes out even to speak to the monk. So the monk just waits there with his alms bowl. Nothing happens. Then he passes on to the next houses. Okay, then after he does this every day for like 3 or 4 years, and then one day the Brahmin father comes out and says, "Pass on, Venerable, we don't give here, we are Brahmins." And then the monk says, "Thank you," and passes on. And then the Brahmin is astounded. He said, "Thank you." Why did he say thank you? I didn't give him anything. So the next day when the monk comes by, the Brahmin comes out and says, "I didn't give you anything, but you said thank you. Why did you say thank you?" And then the monk says, "Well, I've been passing by this way for 4 years, and you never said anything to me. You never even came out. Yesterday, at least you came out and said, 'Pass on, Venerable.'" So I'm thankful that at least you said a few words to me. And then the Brahmin thought, wow, these monks are quite astonishing. I don't say any, all I do is say, pass on, Venerable, and he thanks me for this. Maybe I should offer him something when he comes the next day. So the next day he comes, and when the monk comes by, an alms round, he offers him some food. And then after a few days, he invites the monk to come to his house for a meal offering. And then the elder monk then gets to see the little boy. And the little boy, now 3 or 4 years old, because he's been a Buddhist monk in past lives, he realizes that this elder who has come here is a Buddhist monk. And so he becomes sort of attracted to that Buddhist monk and takes him as a mentor and guide. And then eventually, as he gets older, he becomes ordained as a novice, and then he becomes fully ordained, and then becomes the great exponent of the Dhamma, Nagasena, who engages in this dialogue with King Milinda. Yeah, so this shows both patience, this year after year, the monk goes by the house not getting anything, but still stops and stands there for a couple of minutes before passing on. So that is patience. And when he gets the word, move on, Venerable, we don't give anything here, he expresses gratitude for those, even for that negative response. Okay, so let us now move on. So we've done now what I call the virtues of character: Gauravo, reverence; Nivato, humility; Santuti, contentment; Katanyuta, gratitude; and then Kanti, patience; Sovachasata, being willing to accept advice and guidance from others. And now we come to 3 factors of the Mangala Sutta that are concerned with gaining understanding, knowledge and understanding of the Dhamma. And I would, in my own way of thinking, sort of invert the sequence in which they come in the sutta. Probably, I would say that the sutta has arranged them in this sequence because it has to fit a particular meter. And so I would put the seeing of renunciants first, the first of these 3. And so there's not so much to say about this, but I just took one passage which speaks about such those monks who are accomplished in virtue, concentration, and wisdom, sila, samadhi, and panya, accomplished in liberation, in the knowledge and vision of liberation. Even the sight of those bhikkhus is helpful. Even listening to them, approaching them. It seems approaching which should come before listening. Approaching them, listening to them, attending on them, recollecting them, and then going forth, taking ordination under them is helpful. Because in that way you hear the Dhamma, and then you go into seclusion by way of body and by way of mind. And so here we begin the sequence of learning the Dhamma by way of seeing samananancha dasanang. This is samana, or renunciants, and here it's referring probably specifically to Buddhist monastics, and the seeing of them, even the seeing of them is probably considered beneficial. And this word dasana has a very, very rich ambience within Indian culture. This corresponds to the Sanskrit word darshan or darshana, which is seeing. So even seeing, catching sight of, say, of the Buddha is considered extremely auspicious, even if you don't hear the Dhamma, practice the Dhamma, but just gaining the sight of a Buddha is considered something that really suffuses the mind and uplifts the mind. And if you respond with faith and devotion, it creates a powerful, wholesome factor within the stream of consciousness, or wholesome force in the stream of consciousness. But it's not enough just to see renunciants, but one also has to approach them and to inquire from them, to listen to the Dhamma, to ask questions, to discuss the Dhamma with them. Then maybe we could extend the range of samana now, not only formally ordained people, but even if lay people who are have a rich knowledge of the Dhamma, can expound it well and correctly and fluently, then it's also good to see them and to approach them. And one approaches okay, here the text speaks about 4 things that rightly developed and coordinated at the proper time gradually leads to the destruction of the asavas, translated here as taints. So what are these 4? Listening to the Dharma at the proper time. So it's important when you see renunciants that you go to listen to the Dharma, and then you have discussion of the Dhamma. So this is where you can meet amongst yourselves and discuss the Dhamma. Or you can come to the monastic, and then when you ask questions and get replies, that is also discussion of the Dhamma. But then one doesn't stop there, but then one has to go on to practice. And so then we have developing, these are the 2 wings of Buddhist meditation practice: calm or samatha, which is what leads to samadhi, the collection or one-pointedness of the mind, and developing insight or vipassana, which is what brings panya or wisdom. And so we need these 4 things in order to reach the goal of the Dhamma. And so these 4 things, rightly developed and coordinated, gradually in stages culminate in the destruction of the defilements. And then it's illustrated by a beautiful simile that it's like when it's raining and the rain pours down in thick drops on the top of a mountain, then the water flows down the slope and fills the clefts, gullies, and creeks. These fill up the pools, these fill up the lakes fill up the streams, these fill up the rivers, and then the rivers, when they're full, flow down into the great ocean. So the great ocean is probably the ocean of nirvana, and the stages by which the water flows down are the stages of progress along the path, which begins with seeing renunciants and listening to the Dharma. Yeah, there's an incident actually that just came to my mind right now. This is a story of Sariputta. You know, Sariputta, Moggallana became the 2 chief disciples of the Buddha. And now they were both brought up in probably wealthy, well-established Brahminic families in northern India. And they were brought up in luxury, they had very easy life. And at Rajagaha, every year there was a kind of festival. It's called the Hilltop Festival. Obviously there are a lot of hills around Rajagaha, so it must have been held on the top of one of those hills. And so the 2 young men, they might be in their early 20s, went to see the Hilltop Festival would last several days. And so they went to the festival. On the first day, they sat there enjoying. There would be different, maybe singing and dancing and little skits. Maybe it corresponds, what do they have here in America? Is it a Burning Man festival? Yeah, I don't really know what that is. I've just seen the name. Is there another one like that? Maybe like a rock, not quite the coarse music like rock, but a kind of some kind of a circus, maybe like a circus. Okay, so on the first day, they are enjoying themselves. But then in the evening, after they leave the festival, it occurs to them, or Sariputta starts thinking, after 100 years, all of these actors and actresses, so handsome, so beautiful, the singers with such lovely voices, the dancers, probably doing the traditional Indian dances with dances to music, so skillful, so beautiful, so graceful, are all going to be gone, passed away. And so then they go back. This is what Sariputta is thinking, but they decide, they buy tickets, they go back the second day to the festival. They're sitting there, but not enjoying it so much. They're watching, but not so enjoying. And then at the end of the day, when they leave the festival, Moggallana says to Sariputta, "What's the matter with you? You didn't seem to be enjoying the festival so much today." And then Sariputta told Moggallana, he said, I've been thinking that, just what I said, these actors and actresses, singers and dancers, after 100 years, gone. Like now, where is Marilyn Monroe, Jane Mansfield, Rock Hudson, Tony Curtis? Is he still alive? I don't know. These are the actors and actresses when I was growing up. So all gone. Elvis Presley, Michael Jackson, Madonna's still alive, right? Okay. Oh, the Beatles, at least John Lennon, George Harrison, the drummer for the Rolling Stones, Charlie Watson, who's that?
Ringo Starr.
Excuse me?
Ringo Starr. The Beatles. Ringo Starr, drummer. Oh, the Rolling Stones.
The drummer for the Rolling Stones. I think Charlie Watson, was that his name? Charlie Watts. Charlie Watts. Okay, gone. I'm not completely isolated from this information. Okay, so Sariputta tells Moggallana his thought, and Moggallana says, I've been thinking exactly the same thing. And so they decide, what are we doing continuing to live this worldly life? Let's take up the ascetic life and go forth in quest of the deathless. And so they leave their families, they put on some kind of monastic robes, and they go traveling over India seeking out various teachers, but they're not satisfied. And finally they come back to the state of Magadha, and they have made an agreement between them that even when they go their separate ways, seeking different teachers, whoever discovers the path to the deathless first should come back and tell the other. And it's about this time that the Buddha has attained enlightenment, and he's settled in Benares at the Deer Park, and he's gathered his first 60 disciples and sent them out in different directions. And one of them, one of the first 5 actually, is named Assaji. And as Sariputta is walking around, he sees the disciple, the monk Assaji, walking on alms round from house to house. And when he sees him, just the sight, he's struck by this wondrous sight of this monk walking very calmly and peacefully. He's already an arahant, so he's composed, self-contained, doing everything with mindfulness and clear comprehension. And Sariputta, his sort of eyes are wide, widening, just staring and watching this ascetic and thinking, if there's anybody who's reached the deathless, realized the deathless, this monk must be one of them. He must know the way. But he sees the monk on alms round, so he realizes this isn't the appropriate time to speak to him. So he waits till the monk collects his food. The monk, Assaji, he goes to a little glen and sits down, spreads a mat, takes his meal. And Sariputta waits until he finishes his meal. And then he comes up to him and says, "Who is your teacher? What is the teaching that you follow?" And then Assaji says, "My teacher is the sage of the Sakyans that we call the Buddha, the Enlightened One, and it's his Dharma, his teaching that I follow." Then Sariputta says, "What is his teaching?" And Assaji, though he's an arhat, but he's very modest, he's not an eloquent expounder of the Dhamma. So he says, "This teaching is very deep, and I'm just a beginner." So he's really reached the end of the path, but he says, "My knowledge is not so extensive." So Sariputta says, "Just tell me the essence, that's enough." And then Assaji recites a 4-line stanza, which eventually gets emblazoned upon all of the monuments, Buddhist monuments in India, whether in Pali, Sanskrit, or various other Indic languages. In English, it would go, "Whatever phenomena or dhammas there are that originate from a cause, the Tathagata explains the cause and also their cessation. That is the teaching of the great ascetic." And when Sariputta hears that, that is enough for him. And he reaches the first stage of enlightenment, becomes a stream enterer. And then he goes and finds his friend Moggallana, tells him what has happened. And as soon as Moggallana hears that 4-line verse, he also makes the breakthrough and attains the deathless, or at least the first stage of the deathless. Okay, so let's continue now with, so this is seeing of renunciants. So here Sariputta saw the ascetic, the monk Assaji. He approached him, he heard the Dhamma, didn't have to discuss it, just listening was enough. Okay, but here we have timely hearing of the Dhamma or listening to the Dhamma. And so the suttas give us some advice on how to listen to the Dhamma. So it speaks about 3 kinds of people: one with inverted wisdom, with lap-like wisdom, and with wide wisdom. So the person with inverted wisdom, this person often goes to the monastery to listen to the Dhamma. The monks teach him the Dhamma. And when he's sitting in his seat, he doesn't attend to the talk in the beginning, the middle, or the end. And then after he gets up from his seat, he still doesn't pay attention to what he's heard. So this person is like a pot turned upside down. You pour water into it, and the water, if the pot is turned upside down, you could pour water on it, but the water doesn't go into the pot, but it just runs off and doesn't remain there. So you don't want to be like that kind of person. Then there's a person with, it's called lap-like wisdom. So this person goes to the monastery to listen to the Dhamma. The monks teach him the Dhamma, good in the beginning, middle, and end. And while he's sitting there, he attends to the talk in the beginning, the middle, and the end. But when he rises from his seat, he doesn't try to retain what he's learned. And so the teaching just slips away from him. This is why I say it's valuable to take notes. I see a few people here taking notes, and I applaud them for doing that. Because then you remember, you don't forget what you've heard during the course of the retreat. Yeah, I'll tell you after a while what I did when I was a very junior monk, okay? Okay, so that's the person. So the simile, this is like a person who has various foodstuffs on his lap, sesame seeds or rice grains. Then he gets up without mindfulness, and then all of the grains on his lap get scattered. And so that person loses the teaching he has heard. Then the third person is the one with wide wisdom. This person often goes to the monastery to listen to the Dhamma. He hears the Dhamma good in the beginning, middle, and end. Then when he pays attention as he's listening, and then after he rises from his seat, he retains it in mind. He makes an effort to review the talk that he has heard from the beginning, middle, and end. So that is like a pot that is upright. When you pour water into it, the water will remain in the pot. Yeah, so when I went to Sri Lanka when I was newly ordained, what I did first, my teacher, fortunately, he had the Pali Text Society's English translation series of the Pali Canon in his library. So first I read it in English and made summary notes of the suttas. Then at the same time I was learning the Pali language. And then after a half a year or so, then I went back and started to read the suttas in Pali with the help of the English translations. And I made numbers of headings of the important Dhamma topics, starting, say, with the Four Noble Truths, then the three characteristics, and then each together, then each of the three characteristics separately: impermanence, suffering, non-self, dependent origination, right effort, right mindfulness, the Noble Eightfold Path collectively, then individual factors like right view, right effort, right mindfulness, right concentration, teachings on the Brahma Viharas, and so forth. And then whenever I came across passages that fell under those headings, I made a note of where to find them. And so in that way, when people ask me about a particular sutta, it's not always perfect. Sometimes I make mistakes or can just give the general indication where to find it. But I can say it's Anguttara Nikaya, Book of Fours. It might be around the 150s. So it's not that I have this fantastic memory, but because I've read and made all of these notes, and then I went years later, then I came to translate them, so all of that's imprinted on my mind. Okay, then there are some teachings on the right ways, the wrong way to listen to the Dhamma, and the counterpart, the right way to listen to the Dhamma. So the wrong way to listen to the Dhamma, one disparages the speaker. That is, in one's own mind, one thinks, who is this? He doesn't know anything. He's an idiot. Or you don't like the looks of the person, or you don't like their manner. And so you develop a negative attitude towards the speaker, and then you don't really listen with respect and with a determination to understand, but with a kind of fault-finding mind. And then one disparages oneself, one has a poor opinion of yourself. So you think, oh, I'm too dull, too stupid, I'm not able to understand anything. Oh, this teaching is so profound, so wonderful, who am I to be able to understand it? So that becomes an obstacle. Then one disparages the talk in a way that just is an extension of disparaging the speaker. And then one is unwise, one doesn't have any kind of wisdom, one is obtuse, so one can't understand anything. And then one imagines that one has understood what one hasn't understood. This is really a big obstacle, that you think, oh, I am so knowledgeable, and you don't really have to think you have to pay attention to the speech because you put yourself up on this pedestal and think you are so wise, or you misunderstand the teaching. And then the opposite of that, the 5 right ways to listen to the Dhamma. One doesn't disparage the speaker, doesn't disparage oneself, doesn't disparage the talk. One is wise, intelligent, astute, and one doesn't imagine that one has understood what one has not understood. So this is just one example, but there are other texts, particularly in the Anguttara Nikaya Book of Fives. There were a few others that I didn't include here, but that they're concerned with the right way of listening to the Dhamma. Yeah, I don't really have anything else here. So maybe we could just throw... Oh, yeah, I should have mentioned. So we have listening to the Dhamma. I'm sorry, I almost overlooked one of the Mangalas, and that is Dhamma Sakkacha. This is discussion of the Dhamma, which you could see amongst the 4 things that the Buddha says lead to the destruction of the taints. Yeah, so we have listening to the Dhamma at the proper time and discussing the Dhamma at the proper time. So this is a valuable way to expand your understanding and to correct your understanding, because when you have discussions on the Dhamma, first of all, you have the chance to present your interpretation and to get feedback from others. And sometimes, like if you have misunderstandings and others have more correct understanding, then they could correct your point of view. And then also you get the chance to hear the understanding, interpretations from others, and sometimes they'll complement your understanding. So you could look at a subject, you might be looking at it from one angle, somebody else has a different perspective, and if they present it in the course of the discussion, and if you have an open mind, then you can see, it doesn't mean you have to give up your point of view, but you could say, we could also look at it from another point of view. And in this way you get an expanded understanding. You could see things from different points of view. And if the other person is really wrong, without getting into a quarrel or dispute, you could help others who have misinterpretations to emerge. If you can present good reasons, good logic, and if it's a matter of a textual interpretation, you bring the appropriate text to bear on the discussion, then you can correct their misunderstandings. Yeah, there are several suttas, I didn't include them here, that we find, I remember in the Anguttara Nikaya, I think it's the Book of Sixes, maybe in some of the other books, where the monks are sitting around in a pavilion, and one of them quotes a verse spoken by the Buddha and says, "How should we understand this?" And then each monk presents their own interpretation. And so this is a Dhamma discussion, and then they think, okay, we've all presented our point of view. The Buddha is here, he's in his cottage. Let's go to the Buddha and see which one of us is correct. And so they go to the Buddha, and one of the monks relates the conversation, the interpretations of all of the other monks. And then the Buddha says to them, "You have all spoken well." That all of them have given a correct interpretation, though it's a different interpretation. But he says, this is what I originally intended. Yeah, so even the Buddha says that though only one of the monks gave the interpretation that corresponded exactly to what the Buddha meant by his statement, but the Buddha says that they've all spoken well. That same statement could have been understood from different points of view. Okay, so now I think we can see if any questions come up. It can relate either to these topics or to anything that came up earlier in the morning on the inner virtues. So if you want to ask the question, you can raise your hand. Okay, so I'll look online. Okay, so we take them in order. So I see first is Samangi.
Yes, Bhante, thank you for your teaching.
Let me just put the earphone in. Okay, you can go ahead.
Okay, yes, Bhante, thank you for your teaching. When you were saying about seeing an arahat or a monk, even not an arahat, that you can that can lead to somebody wanting to follow the path. So since we live in a day of we live in times that we don't, at least not knowingly, don't see arahants, and what sometimes kind of the opposite can happen if you happen to meet monks who are not following the correct Buddhism, very commercial,
Yeah.
and so on. So how do you, and because I know monks like you are there, it's not likely that I will get what do you say, confused and leave, not want to follow the Dharma. But it is possible because by what of who we see that it can be that it can work in the other direction as well.
Wait, I didn't quite catch the last thing you said.
So
Okay.
if you see a good monk and you want to follow the Dhamma, it is possible that it work in the other direction when you see monks that are not the good monks behaving in the right way. Then it can push you off wanting to even follow this if you're new to Buddhism and so on. So what are the ways of someone who can guard? How can someone guard against that happening? I'm talking more about somebody who's more new to Buddhism than I am. Even
Yeah.
it happened to me, but it happens a lot to some newer people.
Yeah, I have to say that it's a very genuine problem. And this is a reason why the Buddha insists that monks should behave properly and act in accordance with the discipline. In fact, it's given as two of the reasons why the Buddha lays down the rules of the Vinaya, the discipline. One is so that those who, without confidence or trust in the Dhamma, will gain confidence or trust in the Dhamma when the monastics are behaving properly in accordance with the discipline. So that's one reason. And the second reason is so that those who already have trust or confidence will increase in their trust and confidence. And so the Buddha was very much aware of the impact of the behavior of the monastics, the impact that has on the trust and confidence of lay people, especially those who are not yet, convinced about the Buddha's teaching, but encounter it through the behavior of the monastics. And I don't know an easy remedy for that problem, just that one has to try to avoid associating with monastics. I have to say, when I say monastics, usually I try to include both monks and nuns, but to be very, very frank, the behavior of the nuns is generally exemplary. The real problem lies. Truly, I'm not exaggerating. The real problem is with the behavior of monks. And just the only advice is, to avoid them and to associate and try to learn from good monastics.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, and when I was okay, let me just go back. Yesterday, I think it was yesterday, when I spoke about avoiding the first two Mangalas in the Mangala Sutta, avoid associating with foolish people and associate with good people, with wise people. And then I said, you have to be very careful about appearances, because appearances can be very deceptive. And this has it's a really big problem in American Buddhism that's exploded over the last few decades. If you follow, the news, the Buddhist news, particularly, it occurs in all schools of Buddhism, but I have to say there's the Tibetan Buddhism that's been especially vulnerable to that kind of transgression. But also we've seen it in Zen circles, in the behavior of Theravadan monks as well. And you just have to be very discerning. Don't be taken in by beautiful external appearances, but as that sutta that I quoted yesterday says, you associate with the person for a long time, and you pay attention, and you reflect wisely on their conduct.
I mean, sorry. So yesterday somebody asked if you give jewelry to wife, they become greedy, something along those lines. And I have had experience, my generosity. I gave a lot, I donated a lot, and then to several temples, and then they thought I was somebody to exploit. And if I had not been more grounded in Buddhism, it would have kicked me out of the whole thing.
Yeah. So you just have to keep your faith, your confidence, your trust. Avoid the misbehaving monastics, or mainly monks, and associate with the good ones.
Thank you.
Okay, let us move on. So we have this is Alisa.
Yes. Hi, Bhante. Thank you so much for this retreat. And I had a question for you. I hope it's okay on the recollections meditation we did last night and something in the handout. Would it be okay to ask about?
I'm going to deal with the recollections in the talk this evening.
Okay.
So maybe we just pass over your question for now and see if it will be dealt with in the talk this evening.
Sure.
Are you able to come online
Yes.
this evening?
Yeah, I'll be here. Thank you.
Okay. Because if people sometimes are living in the UK, where it will be late at night, or Singapore, the other part of the world, then it's difficult for them. Okay, so next is Samantha Jayatilaka. Samantha, you have to unmute.
Oh, sorry, Bhante, I just lost my connection a little bit. Thank you, Bhante, for this wonderful retreat and taking my question. My answer is in connection with anger. Did Buddha say anything about looking at the underlying cause of the anger? Now, say, for example, if someone is looking after their parents and
I'm not getting the sound so clearly. You don't get it either.
Ask her to speak slowly.
Yeah, maybe speak slowly. It's the sound is coming out a little blurred. Okay, try again.
Can you hear now, Bhante?
I can
hear now, Bhante?
Okay.
It's regarding anger. Did Buddha give any advice regarding, say, if someone gets angry whilst doing a wholesome action like looking after one's parents, and if they're tired physically due to getting up in the morning and having a lack of sleep and everything, and if they react due to that tiredness, in an unskillful way, but doing a wholesome action in trying to help the parents, looking after them, is there any forgiveness there, or a lesser form of unwholesome act come there?
Yeah, I didn't quite catch the last part.
If would that type of anger caused as a result of tiredness, or mental and physical tiredness,
Oh,
not due to hatred,
okay.
because of because you're
Okay.
physically tired, and so that sort of anger, is that karmic action, formations there, Bhante?
Okay, now I think I understand the question. So the question, if a person is tired, sort of worn out by too much work, not
Yeah.
sleep, and then they respond to a situation with anger, is that a negative karmic formation? Is that the question?
Yes, Bhante. Yeah.
I think when there's anger, it would be a negative sort of karmic force, but if it's due to sort of stressful circumstances, probably it's a rather weak force, my supposition.
Yeah. Okay.
And
So
it's not really driven, it's not driven by hatred. Yeah, in fact, this is where I'm a little critical about the Buddha's texts, which tend to sometimes to conflate anger and hatred. It's not necessarily the case that somebody can get angry without having real hatred, and somebody can have a very cool kind of hatred which doesn't manifest in anger.
Yeah.
But Buddhism almost treats anger and hatred as synonymous. So I think these little sort of irritability, since it's rooted in patigha or dosa, it's a negative karma, but since it's imposed by outer circumstances, I say my supposition is it's not so strong.
The intention behind it.
Yeah, exactly.
Lovely. Thank you, Bhante. That's very helpful. Thank you.
Okay, then we'll take Vandana.
Thank you, Bhante, again for your teaching. So I will be quick. So I have a comment about the learning style. So I myself don't take notes at all since my graduate school. I haven't. I like listening, and
Yeah.
I'm listening a lot. Like I'm right now listening to you and while meditating, and I have so much rapture and bliss that I don't want to even write anything, and I never like writing while I'm listening. So just wanted to make this comment, but thank you so much for your teachings.
Okay, that's good. It depends on the person. Some people just like to listen, but if you listen, try to retain in mind the essential points, even if you don't take written notes. I see a lot of hands. One thing that just occurred to me when Vandana was posing that comment, there's a man that I know in India. He is a professor, I think, at the University of Pune. Well, Diogar, Professor Diogar. He is blind, completely blind from birth, but he has a masterly knowledge of Pali grammar and Sanskrit grammar, which he learns entirely by listening. Whatever he hears, he can probably a photographic memory he retains in mind. So people will read to him the classical Sanskrit grammars and Pali grammars, and probably grammars in other languages. And he's also fluent in English. And he's written a thick, dense book, which he gave to me when I met him in India, 2019, a comparison of Pali grammar and Sanskrit grammar, about 400 pages. And it's all based on listening. Diogar, University of Pune. Okay, maybe we just have time for a few more questions, so let's see. Okay, Namki Choi, did you have a question?
Yes, Bante, thank you so much for your teaching. So my question is specific to anger. So my interpretation of your teaching this morning is how to handle anger in intrapersonal and interpersonal relationships,
Yeah.
conflicts.
Yeah.
But I want to know what the Buddha's teachings are when the righteous anger.
Yeah.
Some people call it righteous anger related to social justice issues.
Okay, okay.
That's
Yeah, I think that's a very important question. And so I would distinguish anger as an emotional state which sort of takes control of the mind and obsesses the mind and dominates your mind so that you are sort of compelled to speak and act in certain ways so that you don't have control over your own mind. And I would distinguish that from a kind of what I would call a moral repugnance towards injustice, exploitation, violence, wars, unnecessary wars of aggression, policies of one's own government that one has a moral objection to. And so one can stand up forcefully and strongly to oppose those particular policies, those particular actions, those particular institutions, speak against them, write against them, strongly, forcefully, even a bit vehemently, if necessary, but you have control over your mind. You're not sort of driven, but you let that objection, that resistance, motivate you to stand up and oppose policies and actions and so forth that you consider unjust, oppressive, forms of exploitation. Like if you listen to some of the talks of, say, the Reverend Martin Luther King, particularly his speech called The Time to Break Silence when he spoke up against the Vietnam War. This was April 1967. It's not a soft, sweet speech. He even says the United States is the greatest purveyor of violence in the present world. Very, very strong statement, and is given forcefully and strongly, but not with hatred. In fact, towards the end of his speech, he speaks about how the binding force of the universe, from his perspective, is love, and that we have a sort of obligation to implement that binding force of love in our policies.
Thank you, Bante.
Okay, maybe one or two more questions. Next will be Carol Jean.
Hello, Bhante. I'm sorry I'm not on screen, and thank you. I have a quick question, not a quick question. A question, I don't know if it's a small or large answer. A proper time is alluded to frequently in the teachings today, and I was just wondering if it had special meaning in the teachings.
About proper time?
Well, listening and discussion.
Yeah, specifics are not given, but it's just that for particular activities, one just has to determine what is the proper time. We have Kalena Dhamma Savanam, so it means like from time to time, when you have the opportunity, then you go to listen to the Dhamma. Kalena Dhamma Sakaccha, when you have the proper time, then you go to, you engage in a discussion of the Dhamma.
So basically alludes to just intentional time, the conditions are appropriate for being able to do it. Is that?
Yeah, when the conditions are appropriate.
Yeah, thank you.
It's not that there is 3 o'clock, you're supposed to do this. Of course, we have a schedule here, but
Okay, thank you very much. And by the way, I really appreciate your, the answers to questions your answers that acknowledge the
Yeah, yeah.
realities of on-the-ground life, especially in the United States. Thank you.
Yeah, and I should mention in response to the previous question, yeah, I wrote an essay back in February strongly critical of the Israeli assault on Gaza. I sent it to some of the major Buddhist online journals in this country. They wouldn't accept it for publication. It was eventually accepted for publication by, I wrote a stripped down version where I removed the Buddhist references. It was published on the progressive website called Common Dreams. And then the original Buddhist version is published by, there's a group in California called the Sacred Mountain Sangha, and they organized a sort of symposium on the situation in Gaza, and they collected some essays and published it. I think if their social organization is called Sacred Justice Sangha, perhaps. I'll find the link if anybody is interested. Somebody know? You've seen it? Yeah, okay, I'll find the link later. Okay, so I think now we have to end the question period. If I see that there are a couple of more hands, in the afternoon, I'll give priority to the people who have questions online. Okay, so we'll have to go for the meal now. So let me see, it's 11:20, so we have the meal break until 1:40, then 1:40 we come back for a meditation period, and then we'll continue.